Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our post-election debriefing on the future of American democracy. I'm Suzanne Mettler, professor in the Government Department at Cornell, and I'd like to welcome you to this final webinar in the Democracy 2020 series. This series has been organized by the American Democracy Collaborative, an initiative to consider the state of American democracy through historical and comparative analysis. This project is spearheaded by Jamila Michener, Robert Lieberman, Tom Popinski, Ken Roberts, Rick Vallely, and myself. We've been so appreciative to all of you who've attended these events in this series over the past 6 months. If you've missed some or would like to listen again, we've posted the recordings of each of them at our website, americandemocracycollaborative.org. I want to take this opportunity to thank everyone who has worked behind the scenes and so generously made this series possible. We're particularly appreciative of the Einaudi Center and the Institute of Politics and Global Affairs, both at Cornell University, and their directors, Rachel Riedel and Doug Kreiner, and most especially the tremendous talent and expertise of Jessica Ames, Scott Beamer, and Sherry England. This series could not have happened without them. I'm also particularly happy to introduce the moderator for today, who happens to be my co-author, Robert Lieberman. He is the Krieger-Eisenhower Professor of Political Science at Johns Hopkins University. He's a scholar of American political development, race and politics, public policy, and democracy, and the author of several prize-winning books. His most recent book is Four Threats: The Recurring Crises of American Democracy, which came out of the work of the American Democracy Collaborative, and which Rob and I wrote together. He previously served as provost of Johns Hopkins and as dean of the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. Rob, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Suzanne, and welcome everybody. As Suzanne said, over the course of our Democracy 2020 series this summer and fall, we've explored some of the challenges and opportunities that this extraordinary year has posed for American democracy, including violence and policing, protest and social movements, free and fair elections, polarization and partisanship, and the transformation of the administrative state. Today, as 2020 draws mercifully to a close, we'll also bring our series to a close by reflecting on the tumultuous 2020 election season and what that election and its aftermath might portend for the state of American democracy in 2021 and beyond. To help us think through some of these issues, we're very fortunate to be joined today by three very wise and distinguished guests. So let me introduce them very briefly, and then we'll dive right in. First, Frances Lee. Frances is a professor of political science and public affairs at Princeton. Second, we're joined by Christopher Parker, who is the Stuart A. Scheingold Professor of Social Justice and Political Science at the University of Washington. And finally, Paul Pearson, who is the John Gross Professor of Political Science at the University of California at Berkeley. So thanks to each of you for being with us today. And one last bit of housekeeping before we begin. Let me just remind everyone that our panelists will be answering your questions toward the end of our webinar today. So as questions occur to you, please use the Q&A function to type your questions, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. And finally, if you're a Twitter user, we encourage you to tweet about the webinar using the hashtag Democracy2020. So let's dive right in. And to begin, let me ask each of you to sort of set the scene and give us an overview of where you see American democracy at year's end. The 2020 election tested the political system and brought American democracy close to the brink, as many observers have noted. President Trump fanned the flames by making continued claims, both before the election and since, about fraud involving mail-in ballots, even during a pandemic. And he encouraged his supporters, including white nationalists, to disrupt the voting process. Long after his loss became clear, he and other elected Republican officials still refused, at least publicly, to accept the election results and persisted making unfounded claims of fraud. So I'll ask you to reflect a little bit on how well the political system has responded to these historical challenges. How has this election shown American democracy to be resilient, Or are we still at risk of deteriorating towards some kind of authoritarianism? So let's start with Chris.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for having me. I'm really thrilled to be on this panel of such distinguished scholars. And thank you for Canal and the Bernardi Center for hosting this. Okay, so let me jump right in with this. I think it's somewhat paradoxical, and the state that we currently find ourselves in. So on the one hand, as many have written, that democracy has really received, a stress test, unlike we received, like certainly in the last century or so. And the fact of the matter is that, some people want to say, everything turned out okay ultimately because Trump is out of office and, we're set to right the course. What I would like to do is caution people on drawing that conclusion, because it took a once in a century pandemic and frankly, a moderate old white man for Trump to lose, and it was still too close for comfort. So let's pump our brakes on this just for a second. By the same token, so what we're seeing right now is, and here's the paradox part of this, is that yes, we've received a stress test. However, democracy can be seen as resilient in the following way, is that even though, you have Trump and his supporters, that completely just ran roughshod over the rule of law, making deals behind, trying to, threatening to lock Hillary Clinton up, making those chants and calls for that, really setting the cause of racial justice and gender equality back, right? The issue is that ironically, it mobilized those same constituencies. And so more people had their voices heard in this election than any other election in our history. So if democracy can be considered as, people turning out and voicing their preferences at the polls, the democracy is indeed very strong. But so I would say that we're faced with this paradox. On the one hand, we have, this man and his supporters who really gave democracy, American democracy, a run for its money. But on the other hand, you had those constituencies that were most affected that turned out to beat the tide back. Now, this is only a temporary thing because he got roughly 10 million more votes than he got last time. And so even though he's going to be off the political stage as far as the White House is concerned, there's still this thing called Twitter, right? There's still this thing called the internet, and he will continue to hold sway over the Republican Party. And so that makes us, I don't think we're any less divided now than when we were on November 2nd. That just has to be the case. And, and another thing I want to bring to bear is that even if he doesn't run again in 2024, some people have speculated, there are going to be some Republicans that use his recipe to try to get elected governor, senator, perhaps even president. And that is a serious problem. And it's not without precedent. We saw what happened in the 1960s when Richard Nixon took up George Wallace's approach and devised the Southern strategy, right? And some people would argue that set us on the divisive course that we're on right now. So I'll leave it there.
Great, thanks. Frances, how about you?
So I'll approach this, your large question from the vantage point of, what are we learning about American democracy now here in the contested aftermath of the 2020 elections. First, sort of a small thought that I find myself with a new appreciation for the federal nature of election administration, which is more resilient to efforts at delegitimation than any centralized federal election administration could be. A president or a party bent on delegitimizing the election would find it much easier to do so if they had a single target, a central federal agency responsible for carrying out national elections. Instead, they have to fight against election processes across multiple states, in many states where their own party controls the election machinery. Note how much harder it is for President Trump to contest the election outcomes across so many different closely contested states. Arizona, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Nevada, and Georgia, than it would be if he had just one target and one set of election officials to focus on. So polling has long shown that Americans have much more trust in their state governments than they do in the federal government. And that trust in many ways was vindicated by the performance of those election officials in these elections, that despite the tremendous challenges of administering an election in the midst of a pandemic, we have amazingly notched a new high for turnout, the highest turnout we've seen in a presidential election or national elections since women had the right to vote. Having elected officials at the state level then go on to defend electoral processes and certify election outcomes rests them on a firmer foundation of public legitimacy than would or could exist at the national level. Looking more broadly, there's no question that democratic institutions have been put under huge pressure. Throughout his whole time in public life, Donald Trump has sown doubt about the U.S. electoral system among his supporters. Even before the 2016 elections, he never indicated a willingness to concede defeat should the vote counts not go his way. He repeatedly said that he would only regard the outcome as legitimate if he won. This kind of rhetoric is normal for populist leaders who frame themselves as tribunes of the true and virtuous people. A populist leader regards opponents as illegitimate enemies of the people. In fact, Trump regularly uses that terminology. In Trump's case, it's people who do not support him are not real Americans. Any election loss must therefore be the result of fraud or election rigging. Even in 2016, Trump denied that he lost the popular vote, despite the tallies showing him losing by more than 2.8 million votes. He set up an ill-fated commission to investigate election fraud in the 2016 election, a commission that notably failed to get cooperation from state election officials, including even in Republican states. In response to a commission data request, Mississippi's Republican Secretary of State literally told them to go jump in the Gulf of Mexico. Given that President Trump didn't acknowledge the legitimacy of the election he won, it's hardly surprising that he does not acknowledge defeat in 2020, and he's pursued every option available to him to contest the outcome. But thus far, he's had no success through institutional processes. The courts have rebuffed him repeatedly, with the Third Circuit Court of Appeals decision handed down by a panel of 3 judges, all appointed by Republican presidents, including an emphatic opinion written by a judge Trump himself appointed, stating that the campaign's claims have no merit. Election officials in all the contested states have moved to certify the election results. State legislative leaders have indicated no willingness to appoint Trump electors despite the election outcome. The campaign has lost 38 of the 39 cases it brought. And the 39th merely adjusted the time available for voters to cure defective ballots in Pennsylvania. So it's pretty clear that the institutional barriers to Democratic backsliding are holding here. The most worrisome effects of Trump's efforts have been his successes in persuading many Republicans to question the election results. Recent polling has shown that 70 to 80% of Republicans say that they doubt the outcome. But I wonder how seriously to take those polls. If there are 50 million Americans out there who believe that the election was, fraudulently overturned, why are there not protests on the scale of the women's marches in 2017? Or the Black Lives Matter protests from this summer out in the streets. So it may be that those who profess beliefs of this kind are just cheerleading and expressing themselves as unreconciled to the outcome. But it's not yet clear how consequential these developments will be in public opinion. They are worrisome. Election officials in the swing states have received threats from Trump supporters who probably genuinely believe that vast fraud is underway, but it's not clear how broadly shared those convictions are. So at this point, I would caution against declaring the death of democratic legitimacy on the basis of what people will say in public opinion polls. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Frances. And Paul, how about you?
Well, I want to say thanks to the organizers for putting together this great panel, and it's a privilege to be sharing the discussion with two really fantastic and insightful scholars. And amazing to see on Zoom. I mean, I'm going to miss you when you're gone in some ways. To see 450 people in the audience from all over the country and beyond, it's, you know, we should take a second to appreciate the kinds of conversations that we've been able to have about these challenging issues with, you know, a really wide-ranging audience. So I look forward to people's questions. I'm going to begin taking off from Francis's comments, but I'm not going to stop there. I think it is worth pausing for a moment to celebrate American democracy. I think it is clear at this point that we should characterize Donald Trump as a would-be authoritarian. You know, for a while, people kind of joked around about why was it that he seemed to like authoritarians so much and speak so fondly of them. And I think if there was doubt before, we know the answer now, right? If he could be that kind of political figure, he would be that kind of political figure. So removing someone like that from office is no small thing. We know from what we've learned in recent years about the experience of how democracies can slide into authoritarianism, that it is very difficult to turn that process around. And the longer it goes on, the harder it is to turn around. Right? My own view is that the American political system as we've known it would not have survived another 4 years with Donald Trump in the White House. Right? So that is cause for celebration, right? We dodged a bullet, right? But if you dodge a bullet, you probably don't want to stand in the street celebrating. First of all, dodging a bullet is not easy, right? He came very close to being reelected, in part because of the Electoral College, and in significant part because of the Electoral College, right? It's really easy to imagine a few more votes in those critical states producing an outcome where the current president lost by something like 4% of the national vote, but nonetheless won the Electoral College without having to resort to the kind of pressure politics that he's been trying to produce in the last few weeks. That's frightening. And it is also frightening to realize that just a little bit more political savvy coming out of the White House probably would have produced a different result. A little bit of empathy for the victims of the pandemic, a little bit more willingness to get the deals that Democrats were willing to offer to boost the economy. And we probably would be looking at a second term for President Trump. But the bigger reason to not stand in the street and celebrate is that we know that sliding into authoritarianism is something that can happen gradually. And while, yes, the guardrails of democracy have held so far, it's a little like the story of the guy who's falling from a building, and as he passes the 4th floor, he says, "So far, so good." The thing that I worry about most, and maybe I worry about it more than Francis does, is the reaction of the Republican Party and Republican Party leaders to the behavior of Donald Trump's entire presidency, but especially the appalling behavior of the last few weeks, in which he does everything he can to delegitimize elections, has been met with essentially not a peep from leading figures in the Republican Party, with just a handful of exceptions. And for every one person who protests, there are a number of leading Republican officials who have cheered it on. We'll get into this more, I'm sure, in the conversation, but I think that behavior is of deep concern. It suggests that Trumpism or something like it is not going anywhere, and indeed is likely to strengthen its hold on the Republican Party, solidify its hold on the Republican Party. And I think there's reason for deep concern about how well American democracy can function if one of its two major parties remains attached to that kind of a political framework.
Thanks, Paul. So that answer that you just gave to the opening question leads directly into the second question I want to ask you all to address, and that is about the parties in the wake of this election. Obviously, elections divide parties, but during this election season, as during the Trump era generally, partisan division seems especially acute. So I wonder what's the likely impact of the election on the future of these parties and of partisan division or polarization? Should we, as Paul just suggested, worry about the willingness of many Republicans to go along with Trump's false claims about election results? Does this indicate that that one of the country's major parties is really, in the end, not fully committed to democracy? Or should we, as Francis suggested a few minutes ago, take comfort from the many Republican state and local election officials and judges and others who acted with integrity to protect the electoral process? And on the other side, what about the Democrats? The Democrats are in many ways what stands between us and some kind of democratic decline. But is the Democratic Party too divided or dissipated to play a meaningful role in safeguarding democracy going forward? So Paul, do you want to go a little bit deeper into the partisan angle that you were just discussing a minute ago?
Yeah, I'll focus on the Republicans. Maybe I can circle back to the Democrats later, or let one of my colleagues talk about that. But let me just say why I feel like Trumpism or something like it is here to stay for the foreseeable future in American politics. When Barack Obama was dealing with the Tea Party Republicans in his administration, he famously said, "We just have to wait for the fever to break." Right? We have to wait for the Republicans to come to their senses and come back to a kind of bipartisan compromise based kind of politics in which each side exercises forbearance and recognizes that they need to get along to some extent with the other side. But I think fever is actually the wrong metaphor. A better metaphor is addiction. I think the Republican Party, the dynamics of the Republican Party, Jacob Hacker and I tried to explore these dynamics in our last book, that there's been a process in which the Republican Party has fed this kind of behavior and has developed relationships with surrogate groups, whether it's right-wing media or the National Rifle Association or elements of the Christian right, that feed this kind of intense zero-sum, us versus them, our lifestyle is under threat kind of politics. And that's not going to go away. It's not going to go away first because, as Chris was saying, Donald Trump brought out that vote to an astonishing degree. And actually down ballot Republicans benefited enormously from it. It's a big part of the reason why they overperformed. So Republican politicians, who are concerned about their own political ambitions are going to not be excited about they're going to recognize that force is out there and that challenging it does not make a lot of sense for their political careers. The second thing is that the surrogate groups, right-wing media especially, have every incentive to continue to generate this kind of politics. They profit from it, literally and figuratively, they profit from it. And opposing it, there's no upside really to opposing it. You're just going to get taken over by other groups that are willing to feed it. It's not going to pay off for you individually. And then finally, Republicans Mitch McConnell learned back in 2009 that obstruction pays, right? That a scorched earth policy of resistance to a president of the other party pays off, right? So I don't expect the Republican Party to offer any olive branches or accept any olive branches, either in Washington or beyond Washington.
Thanks, Paul. Frances, how about you? How do you see the parties going forward?
So I'll start out by saying a bit about what I see happening in the Democratic Party in the wake of the elections. And here I see that the fallout from the 2020 elections is to sow discord within the Democratic Party. To say that Democrats are disappointed in the 2020 elections is an understatement. 2 days after the elections, House Democrats held an emotional 3-hour meeting at which moderate members blamed progressives for embracing messaging such as defund the police that got used in attack ads against them. Progressives, in turn, responded by pointing to the importance of engaging with the young people and the urbanites who support the party needs. One progressive member accused the moderates of only caring about appealing to white people in suburbia. So this was not a pleasant conversation. None of this bad blood is good for holding together a party on tough votes. Note, furthermore, it's a party with an extraordinarily narrow majority. It looks like Democrats are going to wind up with only 222 votes in the House of Representatives. And at the best they can hope for is a 50-50 Senate. Now, it looks like Pelosi will have no difficulty winning re-election as Speaker, but her reservoir of trust among her members has been depleted and not enlarged. Meanwhile, Republicans are basking in congratulations. At a moment like this, nobody is second-guessing Republican leaders or quibbling about strategy. Senate Republican leader McConnell already commanded great trust among his colleagues. These outcomes just cement that further. House Republican leader Kevin McCarthy has elevated his reputation. So the upshot, at least in the near term, is that Democrats will likely have more trouble with internal cohesion than Republicans. The midterm elections will loom over the next Congress as House Republicans see themselves as within easy striking distance of retaking the majority in 2022. The same would be true, obviously, for Republicans in the Senate should they fail to get the majority after the Georgia runoffs. The party not controlling the presidency has gained seats in Congress in every midterm election since 1860, save 2. So Republicans will only need to flip a handful of seats to get there, and they will be focused on doing what it takes. Looking back, and this is something that Paul just referenced, McCarthy will recall how effective a tough confrontational approach had been in dealing with President Obama. After a Congress in which Republicans refused to work with Obama on stimulus, financial regulatory reform, or health care, House Republicans won a resounding victory in retaking the majority in the 2010 midterms. McConnell, too, was Senate Republican leader under Obama and pursued a similar strategy of confrontation and non-cooperation, and his efforts were rewarded with retaking the Senate majority in 2014. A Congress of unified government under Trump and a long stretch of being able to confirm conservative judges to the federal courts. So with a track record this successful, I expect Republicans will likely follow a similar playbook in dealing with President Biden. The big question looming over Republicans at the presidential level is, is Trump here to stay, or will there be a successor? I think as long as Trump wants to be the leader of the Republican Party out of power, I think he will continue to be. He can still command a megaphone that's no other Republican leader can match. I don't know if if Trumpism is here to stay post-Trump. However, I think we need that Trumpism needs Trump. That he was the most famous man in the world before becoming the Republican nominee. Most famous, a celebrity in politics. Somebody's been famous since his cameo, long before his cameo appearance in Home Alone. Like, everyone knew who he was, and he had this reputation of being this tough executive who was going to run government like a business. And then he speaks in this plain-spoken way that resonates with his constituents out in the broad public in ways that no other politician can match. So the question is whether he's still around, if there is a post-Trump Republican Party or not. And that's an open question, and it's one we don't have any good precedents to guide us on. So whether he'll be able to retain support, perhaps even, build support, in Andrew Jackson style, talking about the corrupt bargain of the 2020 elections or something like that to build support towards 2024, or whether Republicans will need to find a successor. I think finding a successor will change the Republican Party significantly.
Thanks, Francis. How about you, Chris? How do you see parties going forward?
You know I want a piece of this. Let me tell you guys something. All you guys out there, the audience, right? Trumpism doesn't need Trump. Trumpism was already here, right? He just brought all this stuff to the surface. All of this stuff was already here. Matt and I, in our 2013 book, said, like, hey, look, we got the Tea Party here. Yeah, they're bringing this stuff out. Right. And so when the Tea Party kind of went away, the people with those same sort of dispositions and predispositions remained. Trump came right along and tapped into it. Boom. Here we got Trump. I'm one of the very few people in this country that said this guy was going to win. And it's because Trumpism was already here and it's not going anyplace. It does not need Trump. Right. Trump is a symptom. He is not the disease. Racism, sexism, homophobia, xenophobia, intolerance. That is the disease that Trumpism taps into. Not going any place, and it will continue to cleave the Republican Party.
All right. Thanks. So that leads perfectly into the next question that I want you all to address, and that has to do exactly with racism in the American political system. So, after a year that saw the killings of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, among others, early in the year, a summer of historic Black Lives Matter protests all around the country that captivated our attention and shaped the context of this election. Really brought issues of violence and policing and systemic racism into the campaign as an area of sharp difference between the parties and the candidates. What is this election and what are the results of this election tell us about the prospects for these issues going forward, for the prospects for progress in the fight against systemic racism and on those conditions that you were just talking about, Chris? You wanna go a little further into that?
Yeah, and I'll try to keep it confined to 2 minutes. So just think about, once again, nothing ever really changes. The context changes sometimes, but the issues rarely do. So once again, let's revisit the 1960s, right? We all know this very well. When Johnson, seeking his own campaign, seeking his own presidency on his own terms, staked out an issue of racial progress, right? And racial reconciliation, right? And so what did Goldwater do? Goldwater went the opposite way, right? And staked the Republican Party on racial regress, right? This is not really any fundamentally different now than it was back then. So the more the Democrats need people of color, to help the party, because let's keep it 100%. Black people are the backbone of the Democrat Party, and Black women are the backbone further of the Democrat Party. I've done some experiments that show this is exactly the case. So we see the same thing happening right now. We see this polarization happening right now along racial lines. So this all goes back to what Paul said and what I said before that many years ago. This is about a threat to these people's way of life, right? The Republican Party is a really white man's party, and white men feel under threat. And so as long as the Democrat Party continues to need the votes of people of color and women, and specifically feminists, right, then we're going to continue to have these divisions. And race and racism is not going anyplace. We saw what 4 years of this guy in office did, and he still came too close to winning, right? And he's still saying that all this racial rhetoric. And so, with George Floyd, right, with Breonna Taylor, let's say her name, Breonna Taylor, right? These police they used the Black Kentucky AG, let these guys skate. So the bottom, I mean, I get too emotional about this stuff. So let me just try to calm down for a second. Look, the bottom line is race and racism hasn't gone any place for 400 years, right? It's not going any place then, and it's not going any place anytime soon, especially as people of color continue to exercise our power in the political system. White people and the Republican Party are going to continue to see that as a threat.
Paul, you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, well, I think, first of all, I think Chris is right to put this at the heart of what has been going on in our politics and what is going on in our politics. And I guess a couple of things that I would add are that not everything stays the same, that the demography of the country is changing slowly but steadily in ways, I think, that amp up the sense of threat, along with some other things that are happening in American society, amp up the sense of threat among whites, especially white men, especially whites without a college education. But that demographic change does mean, I think, that there is a prospect of moving the US towards a genuinely multiracial democracy. I wish I could say that I was more optimistic that we'll be able to complete that journey, but I certainly think it's a plausible future. And one of the things that's happened in the last year or two, I think, under the impact of Black Lives Matter, is that you see many white Americans, especially college-educated white Americans, especially younger white Americans, shifting at least the answers that they get to questions in a direction towards racial liberalism and towards an understanding of the realities of structural racism. You know, and I think there's reason for hope in that. I guess I would, to not end on that note of hope, I would say that really taking those kinds of issues seriously involves a lot more than, say, putting a Black Lives Matter sign in your front yard, or even being open to criminal justice reforms that may feel pretty distant to you. We have a society which has hoarded opportunity for whites in enclaves where they can save their tax money for themselves, they can save their schools for themselves. You know, Trump tried to play on these emotions during the campaign. You know, Joe Biden is going to let these folks into your suburbs, right? And that is a part of American history that we are also going to have to wrestle with if we're genuinely going to move to a more racially, a society in which opportunities are spread more widely across races. So that's a super challenging journey. There are not very many societies, if any, out there that have really managed it in a democratic way. So it's a huge challenge, and we're living through that.
Thanks. Francis, you want to pile on here?
So, you know, thinking about what these elections tell us about the future of the fight against systemic racism in American society, to say I don't see much that's encouraging here. In my view, one of the most worrisome developments in American politics has been the extent to which race is becoming the main line of cleavage between the parties. As the U.S. population has become more racially and ethnically diverse since the 1960s, virtually all of that diversity is represented in the Democratic Party. You can see this starkly in the makeup of Congress. The Democratic Party in Congress has grown steadily more racially and ethnically diverse since the late 1970s, such that nearly 40% of the party in Congress now is currently Black, Hispanic, or Asian. Meanwhile, the nation's increasing diversity has just passed the Republican by, leaving its racial composition largely unchanged since 1990. Non-whites have never made up more than 5% of Republicans in Congress. It's no less apparent if you look to the composition of the two parties in the electorate. As gauged by U.S. Census data, the national population has declined from being 90% white in 1950 to 61% white presently. The white share of the Democratic Party has declined in tandem. After 1980, whites began to comprise a slightly smaller proportion of the Democratic Party than of the national population as a whole. Meanwhile, the Republican electorate has barely changed since 1989 in its demographic makeup. So I don't think you can understand Trump's emergence without taking into account these demographic facts about the parties. I certainly agree with Chris that Trumpism was here before Trump in that sense. A major part of Trump's appeal to voters was his willingness to violate taboos around political correctness involving race. He was willing to capitalize on appeals or make appeals to the electorate that other mainstream Republicans wouldn't supply. But I also don't think these elections give us much of a sense that that emerging Democratic majority, that multiracial democracy that Paul referenced, is on the horizon. And there's a big question of where Latino voters are going to side in this racially divided party system. And Biden's underperformance with Latino voters is one of the most striking facets of the 2020 elections, that the fall off in Latino support from between 2020 and 2016 is very notable. And that explains the loss of some South Florida House seats where the Democrats expected to hold and that Hillary Clinton had carried in 2016, along with also the failure to win in a Texas border district where a Republican incumbent was retiring and the Democrats thought was a great prospect. But it was Biden's weakness with Hispanic voters that explains that outcome, and that's it opens up the possibility that the very complex and divided Latino vote will ensure that we don't move too quickly to a party politics that can get beyond race.
Well, thanks. And on that note, we're going to turn from these roundtable questions to some questions from our audience. And before we do that, I just want to apologize to many of you. We've got a stack of more than 40 questions in our Q&A. So we're just not going to be able to get to all of these. So to those of you who have asked questions that we don't get to, apologies, but thanks for your engagement. So we'll begin with a question from Jennifer McCoy, who asks you all to look ahead to the next 4 years. And Jennifer wants to know, what's more likely in the next 4 years? And she gives you three. This is a multiple choice question. You have three options. One, political realignment of some kind, and if so, how? Two, option two is wholesale rejection of the political class due to governance failures and the rise of some kind of outside autocrat, as in other countries. And three, her third option is more of the same, with a new, more competent populist autocrat within an established party who might come to power in 2024. So which of these paths do you think is more likely? Who wants to start out and take that?
I can say a bit about that.
Go ahead, Frances.
So in the lead up to the 2020 elections, looking at the polling, I thought we might be looking at a watershed election in 2020. And if you see a candidate up by 10 percentage points, if that pans out in the actual popular vote, that's a landslide win. It would be the first landslide that we've seen in presidential politics since 1984. Clearly, that did not happen. Democrats did not get yield the gains that they expected in the congressional elections either. And in fact lost seats, so that the Congress is divided down the middle. So what looked to be a potential realigning or critical election wound up being more of the same. This trench warfare between the parties, evenly matched parties, a 50-50 electorate, the same 50-50 electorate that we've had since 2000, even before that. So these narrow divisions of power in our politics, usually resulting in divided government. Any unified government does not last long. Now, a rejection of the political class, there's no sign of that emerging right now. The party's support is solid. President Trump's support, first of all, this was something Chris emphasized in his opening remarks. He turned out 11 million more Republican voters than he did in 2016. I don't think anybody would have expected that there were 11 million more Trump voters out there. And then that happened. And so, the two parties maintain their coalitions election after election with only modest change. Trump's voters were also Romney's voters and McCain's voters, with just changes at the margin. So I continue to see more of the same. Nothing we have seen has indicated any large shifts or major departures from the normal politics that we see.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I think that one of the most striking things about this election is how little reality affected anybody's voting behavior, right? Except, I mean, people were amped up and they came out. But if you told me ahead of time that there was going to be an economic crisis on this scale and a pandemic and a massive social movement in the streets, I would have expected, I think, that it would have shaken up voting more than it did. And I agree with Francis, it's totally on the margins. And political scientists have actually, I think, thought quite a bit about why this is the case now, the way in which partisanship is becoming a form of identity politics, a kind of tribal politics, in which it sort of stacks on top of a bunch of other identities. And becomes something that's very, very hard to dislodge. I guess the one thing I would take from the question that I would juxtapose with that is, I do think what we can look forward to, probably regardless of the result in Georgia, although I think the result in Georgia will make a pretty considerable difference, and we might want to talk about that a little bit, is a trend that I see as longstanding in American politics that coincides with the intensification of polarization, which is massive governance failure. The federal government, to my mind, barely functions now. We're dealing with, you can see this with the pandemic. It's quite extraordinary. We haven't talked about the pandemic. The president doesn't talk about the pandemic, even though something like 3,000 people are dying every day. And Congress is not able to do anything about the pandemic. On a larger scale, the climate change crisis, right? Slow moving, but extremely serious crisis that you need governance to deal with. There is no prospect, right? Given the way American politics is currently organized. I think that the federal government is going to be able to engage on anything like the scale that needs to happen to confront those kinds of issues. Eventually, it is hard for me to believe that continued failure of governance, you can see declining life expectancy in the US. I mean, really, the problems are just, the list goes on, and it's serious. And serious in comparative perspective, we look a lot worse on a lot of these dimensions than other democracies do. It's hard for me to believe that that can go on indefinitely without introducing some kind of radical shock to the system, as the question suggested that it might. But I don't think there's any reason to expect that that's going to happen in 2 years or 4 years, but we certainly see a lot of warning signs.
Chris, you have anything to add to this?
In the interest of time, I will let my colleagues did a fine job. So what they said.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, let's move on. We're really lucky to have in our audience today Tracy Metrano, who was a candidate for the House of Representatives this year in the New York 23rd District, which is the district that includes Ithaca and Cornell. And so we've got a question from the trenches, as it were. And Tracy asks, the focus on the national election avoids the discussion about what happened in House races. You've all alluded to this in some respects. But Tracy says, if one were to ask me, here are the three principal factors that defeated her. One is money. She says, my Tea Party opponent was so well funded by moneyed interests, she couldn't get her message out. Two is media. The media, she says, are not critical. There's no effective investigative journalism in her district. And a third is Democratic blind spots. The National Democratic Party, she says, does not appear to have a clue about what they missed with working and agricultural classes in districts such as hers, the Finger Lakes and Southern Tier, New York. So she's just wondering if you have thoughts about these as factors in what happened in the 2020 election and prospects going forward: money, media, and the sort of disconnect between the Democratic Party and large swaths of what seemed to be Trump's core constituency.
I'd be glad to speak to that question. That, so these elections were quite, they were disastrous for Democrats. From the congressional elections. The presidential election is another matter, but the congressional elections came out worse than anyone expected for Democrats. I don't think money can explain the outcome broadly. Democrats outraised Republicans. They had ample supplies of money at the party level. Now, that's not to say that this is true for in each individual race. So it's not a story of inadequate fundraising on the part of on the part of Democrats. Whether it's a question of Democratic blind spots is unclear, in the sense that we could have predicted where Democrats lost. 13 Democratic incumbents lost. Most of them were freshmen who had won in Trump districts in 2018. Those districts just flipped back in most cases. That's largely the story. It's largely a story of Democrats didn't have to contend with Trump at the top of the ballot in 2018, and they did again in 2020, and they lost accordingly. So Democrats were unable to appeal to districts that were not already inclined Democrats' way in a presidential election. Second reason for Democrats' underperformance was the surprising shift in the Latino vote, which sheds light on a number of outcomes around the country. And then third, split ticket voting was harmful to Democrats. There was not a lot of split ticket voting in the election more generally, but what there was harmful to Democrats. Biden's voters were more likely not to stick with the party down ticket than Trump's voters. You can see this if you compare the total vote that Biden received to the total vote that congressional Democrats received, and then look at that difference and compare it to the difference between the total vote that Trump received and the total vote that congressional Republicans received. There's much closer correspondence in the latter. That Biden won by attracting voters who do not see themselves as Democrats and did not support Democrats down ticket. Now, this is not a large share of the electorate, so mostly it's a story of no split ticket voting at all. But where it occurred, it showed that Biden's appeal transcended the Democratic Party, and he had no coattails.
Chris, Paul, anything to add to that?
I think that's a great answer. I agree with all of that. I guess the only thing that I would just add, partly because it was part of the question, I do think it's striking that Democrats have failed to sell their economic message in rural America, right, or in rural and small town America. They did a little better. I think Biden did a little better than Hillary Clinton did, but that's a pretty striking failure, and certainly, and that's why, I think that's part of the explanation for what Francis was saying, was that he had no coattails. Biden had no coattails, and I think without the ability to sell any kind of economic message in small town and rural America, that's gonna make it a hard climb for a lot of Democratic candidates who have to win more votes in those areas.
So let me say something to what Paul. Let me add to this what Paul and Francis just said, especially what Paul just said. So could it be the case? just throwing this out here, that that because the Democrats have, for the most part, thrown in their lot with people of color and feminists, that maybe, just maybe, this economic message, even if they had a more robust one, it would be difficult for it to be heard, right? I'm just kind of throwing that out there.
Totally agree with that. I totally agree with that. I mean, I think that is part of the underpinning for the kind of identity politics that we see in the parties. That you don't have to scratch very far below this surface of, well, with Trump, you don't have to scratch below the surface at all. But even with other Republican candidates, you don't have to scratch very far below the surface to see a lot of highly racialized themes, that are, very closely connected to the arguments that make the Republican Party attractive to a lot of their voting base.
Yeah, and just one other thing, just to add real quick, and maybe that's one of the reasons why Biden was effective in this regard, because they saw him as safe, moderate, middle of the road, old white man.
Totally agree. But Democrats thought that would do more for them than it did, and would have a bigger. I mean, it did enough to win the election. Again, that's not to be downplayed. But I think to bring it back to what Francis was saying, which I think is totally right. They thought some of that would carry over to other candidates, and it clearly didn't. So if below the presidential level, Republicans kind of got the best of both worlds, right? They got all those voters coming out that Trump brought out, but they didn't get the backlash to Trump that Trump got in, say, a lot of the suburbs where where he really got hurt this time around. So they got the benefits of Trump without a lot of the downside of Trump.
All right. Our friend Rob Mickey asks a provocative question that's sort of along the same lines, thinking about the dynamics of these party coalitions. Rob wants to know, will U.S. democracy be best served by greater incorporation of Hispanics into the Republican Party, on the view that this might moderate the party's white nationalism and the attack on free and fair elections?
I can just speak to that briefly. So we saw this increased support for Republican candidates among Latinos here in 2020, after 4 years of President Trump, with the harshest imaginable rhetoric around immigration, and not just rhetoric, action. Action. The border wall, and humanitarian disasters we saw at the borders with family separations, and yet improvement in Republican performance among Latino voters. So this hardly discourages Republicans from actions that they might have shied away from if we go back to the immediate aftermath of the 2012 elections, when Republicans believed that immigration reform was needed in order to improve the party's standing with Latino voters. That this was the autopsy report after Romney's loss, that the party needed to move in a more inclusive direction. It moved in a less inclusive direction and wound up with a more inclusive coalition. So it's nothing that's happened right now, I think, is moving in the direction that Mickey's question takes us. Yet one would expect long term a more diverse Republican Party to help to moderate on race issues, but we're not seeing that right now. In fact, less moderation on race issues resulted in a more diverse coalition, and notably also a more downscale coalition. It may be that that the Republican Party is becoming the party of the white working class, and potentially drawing in a large share of Latino vote, increasingly large share of Latino voters going forward as well.
Can I speak to this? So
yeah, please go ahead.
One thing I want to make clear is that, Latinos, that is a pan-ethnic label, but lots of ethnicities, right? So, in Florida, you might have Cubanos and some Venezuelans that got on board with the Republican Party But in Arizona, where, most Latinos are Mexicans, right? Then they came out really strong for the Democrat ticket. So let's put that on the table right now. And then we have to think about the motivations. So yeah, so the socialist label, apparently the poll suggests, really stuck with some, right? And so that was a reason, but there were some that also voted, for Trump for economic reasons, right? And some, like many Latinos are very religiously conservative, right? And look what he's done on the court, right? Or conservative, but mainly religiously conservative. So to Rob's question, I don't see incorporating, Latinos, more Latinos in the Republican Party as moderating it some, because those are specific kinds of Latinos who are already on board. So I just don't see that happening.
I may be a little bit more on Rob's side. I don't disagree with anything anybody said about this, but if one is looking at the long-term trajectory for the country and for the health of American democracy, then it seems to me it's likely to be a good thing if the Republican Party is highly motivated to make appeals beyond whites and to recognize that that's going to be critical to their electoral success. I'm not saying that's the solution to all problems, because I agree with what Chris said. And the one thing I would add there, there's a lot of uncertainty. I don't think we know yet about a lot of these things. There's a lot of research to be done to figure out exactly, as best we can, who actually voted for Trump and why. But we know some things. But the thing I would add to the list that Chris just gave is masculinity, right? A particular notion of masculinity, which may have resonated among some minority voters and actually won him some appeal there. But in all of this, we shouldn't forget that what did Trump get? Maybe 35% of the Latino vote, right? That still means that the lion's share of a large and growing electoral bloc in the United States is going to the Democrats. And so as that share of the electorate continues to grow, one could imagine, as Rob is imagining in his question, that the incentive for Republicans to try to figure out ways to reach out to growing elements of that growing voting bloc will be there. And for the health of American democracy, and particularly if we're concerned about the country polarizing increasingly intensely along lines between whites and everybody else, that seems like a good thing if they're trying to reach out to them.
Let me just follow that up just very quickly. So embedded in Rob's question was that, that Latinos, are, that they are less racist, right? Look, there's some Latinos that don't like Latinos, right? So let's just put that out there right now, okay? I just want to just be clear about that.
All right. Let me change gears a little bit and put together two questions that are kind of two sides of the same coin. So on the one hand, Paul Morantz asks about protections against autocracy that seem over the last few years to have failed or broken down. He says the Republican Party didn't prevent Trump's nomination in 2016. The voters didn't reject him in 2016, and Congress repeatedly failed to check his autocratic impulses over the course of his administration. And Paul wants to know, what does this suggest about the state of safeguards against a future autocrat, for example, in 2024? On the other side of the coin, Tom Popinski asks, given what seems like the iron grip that Trump has had on GOP elites, why has it proven so hard for Trump to convince important Republican politicians, such as Secretary of State Raffensperger in Georgia, to help him actually steal the election?
So I'll take the last part, if you don't mind.
Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
I think there are still some never Trump, like really establishment Republicans that are out there, right, who put country before party. And so I don't think we should completely discount them, because I think they're out there, and I think they can be part of hopefully moving forward, a coalition, that will help, dilute Trumpism, as it were. So it's not like all the Republicans are moving en masse, you know, and lining up completely without dissent behind Trump. There are a few holdouts who really put country before party. And so in some research that I've done, and there's a lot more than people think that are out there. They just happen to be outnumbered and therefore outflanked by the Trump wing of the Republican Party.
Let me also join in here, which is, I would follow up on Chris's remarks by pointing to the extent to which Republicans in Congress have been a check on Trump. They are not a vocal check. They do not criticize Trump. They don't contradict him. They are not speaking out in the aftermath of the election. But they have been a check in the form of sitting still and in not doing what Trump asks them to do. Every budget that the Trump administration sent to Congress was dead on arrival, including when Republicans had unified control. President Trump asked repeatedly for immigration reform. The party did not give it to him. In fact, they could not even get to a bare majority in the House of Representatives when they had Republican control. So Trump doesn't dictate to the party. They just sort of sit on their hands, and Congress continues to wield power, in negative power as well as positive power, and they send spending bills to the administration, in most cases negotiated across the four corners so that they have broad bipartisan support. And to those spending bills is attached lots of different policy priorities. So a lot of legislative action has taken that form throughout the Trump administration. Trump has not been a legislative leader. So the problems or questions regarding autocracy, I think, need to focus on the vulnerability of the party system and the inability of Republican office holders to gate check who becomes the party nominee. But in terms of institutional operations, I think you see in the relationship between Trump and the Republican Congress many of the same patterns that Chris mentioned, but that you see with President Trump and Republicans Republican secretaries of state and election officials out through the country. So there are still meaningful checks of Republicans of President Trump.
So I have to say I'm much less impressed than either of you are with the behavior of Republican elites. And even, Tom's question, why didn't the Georgia Secretary of State help the president steal a presidential election, right? That is a pretty low bar. That is a pretty low bar, right? We know that many of these people will turn around in the months to come and introduce all sorts of ideas for restricting access to the ballot, right? As a result of what's gone on, the fantasies that have been spread across the country in recent weeks. We know that they intentionally delayed the counting of ballots in many states, right? Knowing that would sow uncertainty about the election result. And in Washington, I think we know, right, that the president withheld foreign aid from an ally, military assistance from an ally, in order to essentially blackmail officials there into announcing an investigation of his most prominent political opponent. And Republicans did nothing about that, right? So I agree they have their own priorities, right? They're much more focused on passing tax cuts for corporations and wealthy people than some of Trump's top legislative priorities. Some of them they don't like, and so they don't do them. But in terms of protecting the guardrails of democracy, I'm completely unimpressed, and I'm worried.
Wait, let me just speak to what Paul just said. Paul, wait a second. You suggested that I was impressed. Not impressed, right? Not impressed. I'm just acknowledging that there are a few holdouts that go against the grain.
Okay. I was being rhetorical for entertainment purposes.
No.
But I want to emphasize. We can talk about the individuals who have stood up, right? And yeah, that's that's, and the Secretary of State in Georgia is paying a huge professional price for that, right? So that's to be admired. But just, remember what it is that we're applauding him for, right? His unwillingness to steal a presidential election, right? And again, I think one also has to ask, even when one's looking at not his behavior, but the overall pattern of behavior at the states, right? How much of that reflects them standing on principle and protecting the Constitution? And how much of it is them just making calculations about whether or not they think they'd be able to get away with it, right? So, because one of the things, as Francis was saying, like the fact that you would actually have to overturn the results in multiple states, right, makes the challenge a lot bigger, right?
Well,
And
there's
so,
also the question of their own elections, right?
right.
Yeah.
They would be saying, right, well, somehow in all the discourse around how the election was stolen, it's only the votes that hurt Republicans, right, and the outcomes that hurt Republicans that are suspect, not the other ones.
So, if he's stealing the outcome in Georgia, why didn't they do a better job on the Senate races? So, but I would say I didn't mean to imply that I was highly impressed with Republicans standing up to Trump. But my point is that it's important to keep in mind the negative power of a legislature, and that a president cannot dictate to the Congress, even a Congress of his own party. And President Trump most certainly did not succeed in doing so.
But this is so where I think we have a disagreement, and I agree with that, right? And it's important in many contexts, but it is mostly about policy, right? Where they have disagreements about policy, and to my mind, that's mostly because there are particular powerful constituencies within the Republican Party that are important to Mitch McConnell, and people like Mitch McConnell, they have those views on policy. But when it comes to actually protecting the guardrails of democracy, I see very little evidence of Republicans in Congress standing up for that, or even for the power of the Senate, even protecting the power of the purse in a meaningful way. But especially, I think the impeachment case, and which is, and that was the case that got the furthest in terms of exposing the profoundly corrupt and autocratic behavior of this administration. But there are many other cases that could be considered along with it. And Republicans turned a blind eye. They said it wasn't a problem.
All right, well, we are just about out of time. So I'm gonna first apologize to the many, many dozens of you in the audience who had terrific questions that we just didn't have time for. And I wanna just close by thanking Francis, Chris, and Paul profoundly for what was a terrific conversation, very illuminating, and times a little bit uplifting and hopeful, sometimes not so much, but very illuminating and clarifying all the same. So thanks to all of you. Thank you very, very much to all of our audience for joining us. For those of you who joined us throughout the series, we really appreciate your support. And I'll just remind everyone that we have been recording the session, so tell your friends, tell your family, tell everyone that sometime next week it will be available on our website, AmericanDemocracyCollaborative.org, for viewing. And you can also check the website for announcements of future events that we will be convening. So thanks to everyone. Have a great afternoon and a great weekend.